Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're going to dig into something that might genuinely surprise you, maybe even shift your perspective on, well, on the historical Jesus.
It's definitely a topic that sparks a lot of discussion.
Hmm.
Imagine this. You have highly critical, very skeptical scholars looking at the New Testament.
Right, people who really apply rigorous historical methods, often setting aside any personal religious beliefs entirely.
Exactly. And among these scholars, there's this remarkably widespread agreement on something pretty extraordinary about Jesus.
It's honestly one of the most talked about, maybe even startling developments in, critical New Testament studies over the last few decades.
Yeah, there's been a really significant shift, you can almost feel it, in how academics approach the claims about Jesus's mighty deeds, what the Gospels often call miracles.
And that shift, that surprising consensus, is really our jumping off point for this deep dive. We want to unpack the historical evidence behind these alleged deeds. Our mission today is to understand why. Why has the scholarly view moved this way? What specific historical data points are so compelling that they lead researchers, and we're talking atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, skeptics, to conclude that Jesus was in fact some kind of healer and exorcist, maybe even performed other, well, amazing feats.
And we need to be crystal clear about the scope here, right from the start.
Right.
This is purely a historical investigation.
Right.
We are not trying to answer the theological question. Were these divine miracles acts of God? That's a different kind of question, maybe for philosophy or theology.
Historical methods, they're really about what happened, aren't they? Not necessarily the ultimate why or how.
Precisely. Think of it like historical forensics, we're asking. Based on the ancient evidence we have, did events like the ones described in the Gospels actually occur?
So when we use the word miracle in this discussion, we're mostly using it like the ancient sources did.
Yeah, referring to amazing feats, or real healings, or simply the miracle claims themselves without automatically jumping to a supernatural cause. That's not the historian's first step.
Okay. And the basis for this deep dive is a source that brings together insights from a whole range of scholars, covering the spectrum.
Absolutely. Conservative, liberal, atheist, agnostic, Jewish scholars, prominent skeptics.
Yeah.
It's a broad look at the academic landscape on this specific issue.
Great. So let's get right to it. What exactly is this surprising consensus, and what's the historical data driving it? Why do so many different minds agree on this point about Jesus's life? Let's unpack this. Okay, so the first big thing, the real attention grabber, is this scholarly consensus itself. It sounds pretty significant.
It really is. It's often described as an absolutely amazing feature of recent critical New Testament thought. When historians apply their standard critical methods to the Gospels and other early writings about Jesus, there's this widespread, almost universal agreement that Jesus was, at the very least, known as a healer and an exorcist, and that events matching these descriptions probably happened. This holds true, importantly, virtually across the scholarly spectrum.
And just to underline that, again, this agreement doesn't mean these scholars suddenly believe in divine intervention.
Not necessarily, no. It means they look at the evidence and conclude that events, at least very similar to what the Gospels describe, actually took place. Even scholars who start out quite skeptical about anything supernatural tend to land here.
Can you give some examples? Who are we talking about?
Sure. Take someone like Rudolf Bultmann. He was a hugely influential and, frankly, quite skeptical theologian from an earlier generation, known for demythologizing the New Testament.
Right, trying to strip away what he saw as myth.
Exactly. Yet even Bultmann acknowledged, historically speaking, there was no doubt that Jesus healed the sick and performed exorcisms. He even conceded some of these accounts originated in the very earliest church. That's a huge admission from someone like him.
Wow, okay. And more recently?
The consensus continues. Gerald Fossum points out that miracle working is just central to the Christology, the understanding of who Jesus was in the Gospels and Acts. It's foundational to how he was portrayed from early on.
And what about someone from, say, the Jesus Seminar? They were known for being quite critical.
Good example. Marcus Borg, a very prominent member of the Jesus Seminar, stated it quite bluntly. He said, "It is virtually indisputable that Jesus was a healer and exorcist, purely on historical grounds."
Virtually indisputable. That's strong language from that quarter.
It is. And Borg went further. He acknowledged that you can't just explain all the healings away as simple psychosomatic effects or faith healings. He admitted the full extent of whatever power Jesus had remains historically unknown.
Okay, anyone else?
John Meyer. He's known for being incredibly rigorous, almost minimalist in his historical Jesus research. His conclusion is maybe the most striking.
What does he say?
He asserts that the statement, Jesus was viewed as and acted as an exorcist and healer, has as much historical corroboration as almost any other statement we can make about the Jesus of history.
As much as almost any other statement.
Yes. And get this, he adds, it's actually better evidence than many other things scholars routinely accept about Jesus.
That's quite a claim.
It is. Then you have Graham Twelftree, a specialist whose focuses research specifically on Jesus's miracles. He comes to very similar conclusions as Meyer.
Okay.
After really detailed work, Twelftree says, there is hardly any aspect of the life of the historical Jesus which is so well and widely attested as that he conducted unparalleled wonders. He even concluded these deeds were arguably the most important aspect of Jesus's whole pre-Easter ministry.
The most important aspect. Wow.
Then there's Craig Keener. He's done a massive survey of the whole scholarly discussion, and he points out something fascinating. All the ancient sources, including non-Christian ones,
Like who?
like critical references in Jewish rabbinic writings or criticisms from the Roman philosopher Celsus in the 2nd century. All of them agreed that Jesus performed amazing deeds or miracles. None of them tried to deny the events happened.
So what did they argue about then?
They argued about the source of his power. Was it divine? Was it magic? Was it demonic? But the fact that he did things that needed explaining wasn't really disputed in antiquity.
That's a crucial distinction.
Keener lists about a dozen ancient sources: Mark, Q, Matthew's special material, M, Luke's, L, John, Paul, early creeds, Acts summaries, maybe even Josephus, all pointing to Jesus as a miracle worker. And he notes that the essential substance of the miracles themselves remains unchanged across these sources, even as they were written down over time.
So the core story stays consistent.
Right. Keener even quotes Morton Smith, a really radical critic, who dismissed the supernatural element but still argued that miracle working is the most authentic part of the Jesus tradition.
Even the critics saw it as central historically.
And James Dunn, another major scholar, calls Jesus' reputation as an exorcist and healer one of the most widely attested and firmly established of the historical facts with which we have to deal. He insists this goes right back to the earliest messages about Jesus, and the stories were told as miracles from the first.
So this isn't just one or two scholars, it's a broad trend.
Exactly, and the power of it is the diversity. Atheists, agnostics, Jewish scholars, Christians of all stripes, when they apply the standard tools of historical criticism to the ancient data, they tend to converge on this point. The evidence suggests Jesus was involved in healing and exorcism.
Okay, so what does that mean then? This wide agreement across different perspectives.
It means the historical data itself must be pretty compelling. It forces critical scholars, whatever their personal beliefs, to grant that Jesus was associated with these kinds of events. They might debate the nature of the events, the cause, but the occurrence itself seems hard to deny based on the sources. It's a major consensus built on historical investigation.
All right, so if that's the consensus, this surprising agreement, the obvious next question is why? What is this historical data that's so convincing?
Exactly. Now, we pivot from the conclusion to the evidence that led scholars there.
And you mentioned this applies mainly to healings and exorcisms, which even skeptics often accept, but maybe also nature miracles.
Right. Healings and exorcisms get the widest acceptance, definitely. Nature miracles like walking on water or multiplying loaves are sometimes viewed with more skepticism. But interestingly, the historical criteria we're about to look at actually provides support for all three categories: healings, exorcisms, and nature miracles.
Okay, so let's get into these criteria. What's the first one?
Probably the bedrock, the strongest criterion for many historians is multiple independent attestation.
Multiple independent attestation. What does that mean exactly?
It's pretty straightforward. If a story about Jesus or a saying attributed to him shows up in several different sources, and historians are confident these sources didn't just copy from each other.
So they're independent witnesses, basically.
Yes. If they're independent, it's much more likely that the story or saying goes back to an earlier tradition, maybe even to Jesus himself, rather than being invented by just one author. One source could make something up. Multiple independent sources pointing to the same thing, that's much harder to explain away as invention.
Okay, that makes sense. How does this apply to the miracles?
This is where the evidence for Jesus as a healer and exorcist is just remarkably strong. Accounts of these activities are found independently in every single one of the major sources scholars identify behind the Synoptic Gospels.
So Mark.
Mark, yes, but also the hypothetical Q source, which Matthew and Luke seem to have used.
A saying source, right?
Right. And Matthew's unique material M and Luke's unique material L. All four of these generally accepted independent streams of tradition contain accounts of Jesus healing and performing exorcisms. This level of attestation is so solid, it's basically a scholarly consensus from liberals such as the Jesus Seminar to conservatives.
Wow, okay, so it's in Mark, Q, M, and L. Anywhere else?
Oh, yes. John's Gospel also has miracle stories, and many scholars think John, and maybe parts of Mark too, drew on an even earlier independent collection of miracle stories, sometimes called a sign source or miracles collection.
So potentially another independent line of evidence.
Exactly. It adds another layer of early, separate testimony to Jesus' reputation as a miracle worker.
Now, what about the nature miracles? Are they multiply attested too?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe less widely known. The answer seems to be yes. The source we're drawing on argues that even nature miracles get mentioned in each of those major synoptic sources, Mark, Q, M, and L, and also in John.
Really? Even in Q, the saying source?
Apparently so. The source highlights that passage where Jesus answers John the Baptist's disciples. He lists the signs of his ministry: the blind see, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, standard healing miracles. But then he adds, the dead are raised.
Raising the dead, that's definitely a nature miracle. And it's in Q.
Attested in Q, according to this analysis, which is remarkable for such an early, generally non-narrative source.
You mentioned Bart Ehrman earlier, a skeptical scholar. What does he say about this principle of multiple attestation?
Ehrman explains it very clearly. He says, basically, if something's only in one source, maybe that source made it up. But if it's in several sources and they didn't get it from each other, then none of them likely made it up independently. The tradition must be older than all of them. So, finding something in multiple independent sources significantly increases the probability that it's historically reliable.
So if we list the independent sources, attesting Jesus as a miracle worker or exorcist.
Just looking at the canonical text, you've got Mark, Q, M, L, John, and Paul's writings. Plus, you have those pre-Pauline creedal traditions, he quotes, and the summaries in Acts, which seem very early.
And the potential mention in Josephus, the non-Christian historian.
Right, that one's debated but possibly relevant, so that's a lot of independent lines of evidence. And crucially, the source points out that virtually the same list of sources also contains attestations for nature miracles.
So the evidence base isn't fundamentally different for nature miracles compared to healings, at least in terms of multiple sources.
In terms of multiple independent attestation, the argument is that it's surprisingly similar. This strong foundation across diverse, early, independent sources really helps explain why scholars accept the healings and exorcisms, and it poses a serious challenge to dismissing the nature miracles out of hand based on this criterion alone.
And presumably this suggests the oral traditions behind these written sources are even older.
Absolutely. It pushes the tradition of Jesus the miracle worker right back towards the time of his actual ministry.
Have scholars tried to map these layers of tradition?
Yes, people like John Dominic Crossan have done meticulous, though sometimes debated, analyses trying to date different layers or strata of the Jesus tradition.
And what does his analysis show about miracles?
Even with debates about his specific methods in dating, Crossan's work clearly shows miracle reports are deeply embedded in what he considers the earliest layers of tradition. His first stratum, which he dates around AD 30-60.
So the first 3 decades after Jesus.
Right. He argues this layer includes things like early Pauline fragments and a hypothetical miracles collection. And alongside core events like the crucifixion and resurrection appearances, this earliest stratum, according to Crossan, already contains miracle reports.
What kind of miracle reports?
He looks at reports with double independent attestation within this earliest layer. He finds things like the healing of a leper, healing a boy from a distance, healing a blind man.
So specific healings are tested very early by multiple sources in his model.
Yes, but here's the kicker. According to Crossan's analysis, this same group, doubly attested in the earliest stratum, also includes nature miracle reports like Jesus walking on water and the raising of Lazarus.
Walking on water and Lazarus in the earliest doubly tested layer.
According to his reconstruction, yes. So this incredible collection, as the source calls it, of independent texts, oral traditions, early dates. It builds a really strong historical case, primarily through multiple attestation, for why almost all critical scholars accept Jesus was known as a miracle worker and exorcist.
Okay, multiple independent attestation is clearly powerful. What's another key criterion?
Another really important one, especially for grounding the healings and exorcisms, is enemy attestation.
Enemy attestation. We touched on this, what his opponents admitted.
Exactly. The principle is, if someone hostile to a person or movement concedes a particular point, even if they spin it negatively, that point is highly likely to be historically true. People rarely invent things that make their enemies look powerful or impressive.
And how does this play out with Jesus?
It's illustrated vividly right in the Gospels. Remember, Marcus Borg pointed this out. Jesus' opponents, like the scribes and Pharisees, they didn't deny he was doing healings and exorcism.
Right, they didn't say it's fake.
No.
Oh.
Instead, they accused him of doing it by the power of Satan, or Beelzebub, the prince of demons. We see this accusation in Mark, in Luke, and it's also attested in the Q source.
So historically that's significant because...
Because by making that accusation, he casts out demons by the ruler of demons. They were implicitly admitting the events happened. They saw something undeniable, something powerful that needed explaining. Their explanation was demonic power, not divine power, but they weren't denying the phenomenon itself.
They conceded the what, just not the why or by whose power.
Precisely. They didn't say that guy wasn't really healed or that wasn't a real exorcism. They said effectively, he did it, but he's using dark forces.
The source also mentioned opponents were present for nature miracles too.
Yes. It points to scenes like the guards at the tomb in Matthew 28, or the crowds witnessing events in Mark 5 or John 11. The implication is that opposition or skeptical witnesses weren't absent from those events either.
And you mentioned ancients didn't really distinguish miracle types like we might?
Right. They tended to just see them all as mighty deeds or signs or wonders. They didn't have our modern categories or urge to find purely natural explanations for everything.
So how does enemy attestation strengthen the overall case?
Well, Borg argued, and many agree, that this convergence, Jesus' followers, the crowds, and his enemies all acknowledging that these healings and exorcisms were taking place, makes the basic historicity of these activities practically indisputable for critical scholars.
Okay, that makes sense for healings and exorcisms, but what about nature miracles? Did enemies attest to those?
This is where it gets, as the source says, really interesting. While the Beelzebub accusation specifically targets exorcisms, the broader point is this. The same sources, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, Q, that provide this powerful evidence, multiple attestation, enemy attestation for healings, exorcisms, these very same sources also contain the nature miracle accounts.
Ah, I see the tension.
Exactly. If the evidence from these sources, bolstered by enemy attestation confirming something powerful was happening, is strong enough for us to accept the healings and exorcisms historically, then on what consistent historical grounds do we reject the nature miracles found in the same sources?
It starts to look like picking and choosing based on what fits our worldview.
That's the challenge posed. Rejecting the nature miracles while accepting the healings exorcisms, when both are supported by similar patterns of attestation in the same body of source material, can look like what historians call a priori bias or special pleading. You're setting a different evidential bar based on the type of event, rather than letting the sources speak for themselves using consistent criteria.
And the suggestion is this realization might be why some skeptical scholars, like Borg, became more open to the possibility of real exorcisms or even nature miracles happening.
Plausibly, yes. The methodological pressure, the fact that the data supporting nature miracles isn't fundamentally weaker within the sources themselves, might push scholars who are committed to following the evidence to be more open, rather than imposing a modern philosophical filter that automatically excludes certain possibilities.
Okay, so we've looked at broad criteria like multiple sources and enemy attestation. Do scholars also look at individual miracle stories in detail?
Absolutely. Specialists like Twelftree and Meyer don't just look at the general picture. They dive deep into specific accounts, looking for internal clues or marks of historicity that suggest a story reflects genuine memory rather than later invention.
And they find stories supported by multiple criteria.
Yes, that's the key. They find individual accounts where several different indicators of historicity seem to converge, making those particular stories strong candidates for being historical.
Can we look at an example?
Sure. Let's take the healing of blind Bartimaeus in Mark 10. Meyer calls this one an unusual convergence of an impressive number of elements pointing to historicity.
Okay, what kind of elements?
12th tree points out several things. It seems to be an early report, likely predating Mark, maybe from an eyewitness. It has an embarrassing element. It has clues pointing to an Aramaic original, and maybe even a hint of what's called the criterion of dissimilarity.
Well, let's break those down. What are the specific details?
Well, first, the man is named Bartimaeus. That's rare in Mark for someone healed who isn't a disciple. His name itself is Aramaic Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus.
The language clue.
Right, and he addresses Jesus with the rare Aramaic title Rabboni. These linguistic details strongly suggest the story originally circulated in Aramaic before the Greek Gospels were written, very early.
What about the embarrassing element?
The crowd. Instead of being helpful, the people around Jesus, surprisingly, upsettingly nasty, rebuke Bartimaeus, telling him to shut up.
That doesn't make the disciples or the crowd look good.
Not at all. And that's a strong sign of authenticity. Why would the early church invent a detail that makes Jesus' followers look bad? Embarrassing details often get preserved in real memories, even if they're inconvenient.
Okay, Aramaic origins, embarrassing detail. What was the dissimilarity hint?
Bartimaeus calls Jesus son of David. 12th tree notes that while this became a big Christian title later, it wasn't a standard, widespread, pre-Christian Jewish messianic title in quite the same way. Its specific, unique use here in Mark might reflect an authentic, early way Jesus was addressed, distinct from both typical Judaism and later church usage.
And Meyer adds things like accurate geography and customs.
Yes, Meyer notes the specific Palestinian geography the Jewish customs implied, the location near Jericho, the time of year, it all fits the historical context. His conclusion: Bartimaeus is one of the strongest candidates for the report of a specific miracle going back to the historical Jesus.
Okay, that's a compelling case for that one. Another example.
How about the healing of the deaf man in Mark 7? Again, 12th tree finds signs of an early, maybe eyewitness report, an embarrassing detail, and a key Aramaic term. He also notes it uses a lot of words that aren't typical of Mark's style, suggesting Mark got it from an earlier, less polished source.
What's the embarrassing detail here?
It's Jesus' method. He puts his fingers in the man's ears and uses his own spittle.
Spittle. Yeah, it sounds...
Awkward.
Exactly. It's weird, kind of messy, different from how Jesus usually heals in Mark, and potentially embarrassing. Meyer points this out too. It's highly unlikely the church would invent that detail. It feels like a preserved, slightly uncomfortable, real memory.
And the Aramaic term.
Jesus says, "Ephatha," which Mark translates as, "be opened." That's almost certainly the original Aramaic word Jesus used, preserved in the tradition.
So the conclusion for this one?
12th tree thinks these features augur well for this story's faithfully reflecting an actual event. Meyer agrees, highlighting the non-Markan words, the embarrassing saliva, and the Aramaic. He adds that the use of saliva and fingers shows discontinuity. It doesn't seem to come from standard Jewish or later Christian practice, making it a strong sign of authenticity based on that criterion too.
Okay, one more. Maybe an exorcism.
Let's look at the story in Mark 9, the boy with the spirit Jesus' disciples couldn't cast out. This one shows coherence, embarrassment, and signs of being an early report.
Coherence means it fits the pattern of exorcism stories. Yes, the way the story unfolds aligns with how exorcisms were typically understood and described in that culture.
And the embarrassment.
Jesus gets frustrated. He rebukes the disciples and the whole crowd as a faithless generation. This shows Jesus in a negative, exasperated light, which the early church probably wouldn't invent. Tellingly, Matthew and Luke seem to soften this rebuke in their versions, suggesting Mark's harsher version is earlier and more authentic.
Less polished, more real.
Potentially, yes. And it also seems like an early report because Jesus mentions that this kind of spirit requires prayer, and some manuscripts add fasting. This specific instruction wasn't really emphasized or built upon by the later church, suggesting it's an authentic detail from an earlier stage, not a later theological point being inserted.
So 12th tree and Meyer see this as likely historical too.
Yes, 12th tree is confident it faithfully reflects an incident. Meyer adds that Semitism's hints of an Aramaic original language also point to it being an early real tradition before Mark wrote it down. So again, multiple criteria converging on a specific story.
It's clear how applying these methods to individual stories builds a case. Now, back to the nature miracles, the most controversial ones.
Right. And the source argues the controversy is often driven more by modern assumptions about what's possible, rather than a total lack of historical evidence within the ancient sources.
And you said Meyer and 12th tree actually think the evidence favors some of these, even raising the dead.
Yes, remarkably. Despite these being the most disputed, Both Meyer and Twelvetree, after applying their historical methods, conclude that the evidence points towards the historicity of key nature miracles, including the specific instances where Jesus is reported to have raised someone from the dead, Jairus' daughter, the widow's son at Nain, and Lazarus.
They think those events likely happened.
They rate them somewhere between probable and fairly certain historically. Twelvetree is generally more positive in his assessments across the board, but crucially, neither scholar dismisses these raising stories based purely on historical analysis of the gospel texts.
That's quite something. Does Twelvetree give an overall summary?
He does. He analyzed 29 specific miracle accounts in detail. He concluded that 22 of them reflect historical events with high confidence, and significantly, this group includes at least 5 nature miracles, specifically naming all 3 raisings from the dead.
22 out of 29 with high confidence. And what about the other 7?
For the remaining 7, he finds the evidence insufficient to firmly establish their historicity using historical methods alone. He's careful to say this doesn't prove that didn't happen, just that the historical data isn't strong enough for high confidence judgment in those cases. But he explicitly states, "We have found no good evidence that any of the miracle stories are legendary or have their origins outside the Christian tradition."
Okay. And Meyer's summary?
Meyer, while always cautious, reiterates that multiple independent attestation is key for healings and exorcisms. But then he makes that striking observation about the raisings. All 3 reported instances enjoy remarkably strong multiple attestation in the sources. Mark, John, L, and Q.
Mark, John, L, and Q for the raisings. That is strong attestation.
It includes Lazarus in John, leading Meyer to conclude that even during his lifetime, Jesus was thought of by his disciples to have raised the dead. He stands by his earlier point, the miracle worker aspect has as much or more historical backing as almost anything else about Jesus. And he warns that critics who ignore this produce a domesticated Jesus, stripped of a core element attested strongly by the data.
Do they differ on whether these were divine miracles?
Yes, that's an important distinction. Twelvetree seems more willing to conclude, based on his analysis, that some events required divine intervention. Meyer, adhering strictly to what historical method alone can demonstrate, argues history can show an event likely happened, but it can't definitively prove God was the direct cause. But again, both are open to or find the data supports the occurrence of events like raisings.
Beyond these core criteria, are there other, maybe more subtle, indicators scholars look at?
Yes, the source mentions several additional marks of historicity that support the miracle reports.
Like what?
One is coherence. Scholars like Fuller and Borncombe point out how well Jesus' miracles fit, or cohere, with his overall message and actions, especially his teaching about the kingdom of God. Fuller saw them as signposts of the kingdom's arrival. Borncombe stressed the congruence between Jesus' authoritative words and his powerful deeds. They reinforced each other, drawing people in. They weren't just random magic tricks, they fit his persona and message.
Okay, coherence. What else?
Twelvetree highlights Jesus' unique methods, particularly in exorcisms. Compared to other ancient exorcists, Jesus' approach was distinct. He didn't typically use magical objects or formulas. He didn't need to argue with the demon or prove it left. He didn't usually invoke God's name or other authority.
He just commanded them directly?
Often, yes. He seemed to act on his own authority. Twelvetree connects this directly to Jesus' belief that he was enacting the kingdom of God, that Satan was being defeated through these actions. His unique method reflected his unique claim and authority.
Interesting. Any other subtle clues?
Bruce Chilton from the Jesus Seminar points to textual oddities in certain stories that suggest they're very old pre-Markan traditions. For example, in that Mark 1 exorcism, the demon calls Jesus by name, Jesus of Nazareth, Holy One of God. In ancient thought, knowing someone's name could give you power over them. So this detail might portray Jesus initially on the defensive, which doesn't fit Mark's usual picture of Jesus' effortless authority.
An awkward detail, like the spittle.
Exactly. Chilton also notes the demon acts violently as it leaves, trying to harm the man. Again, maybe not quite fitting Mark's usual smooth portrayal. These little inconsistencies or oddities are hard to explain if the story was a later polished invention. They suggest an older, rougher, more authentic tradition is being preserved.
So these extra points, coherence, unique methods, textual oddities add more layers to the case for healings and exorcisms.
They do. They provide further corroboration beyond just the big criteria.
Do these kinds of additional marks show up for nature miracles too?
Yes, surprisingly often. Even though these are often seen as more out there, scholars find similar, subtle indicators of historicity in some nature miracle accounts.
Like which ones?
Murray Harris looked closely at the raising of the widow's son at Nain in Luke 7. He notes Luke gives the specific name of Nain, a really obscure village Luke never mentions again. Why invent such an insignificant place?
Point. A bigger known city would seem more likely for an invented story.
Harris also points out the details of local custom. The mother walks before the funeral bier. That was the correct custom for Galilee, where Nain was, but not for Judea. That kind of specific regional accuracy suggests an authentic memory from Galilee.
It's a very specific detail.
And he notes the story itself is exceptionally restrained. No speculation about the afterlife, unlike some other ancient texts or even Jesus' own parables. It just reports the event simply.
What about Jairus' daughter? You mentioned embarrassing details there earlier.
Right. Harris highlights those again. Jesus saying she's only asleep, which seems to downplay the miracle, and the fact that the mourners openly scorn and ridicule Jesus for saying it. Unlikely inventions by followers.
And also unneeded details.
Yes, like the crowd pressing in, Jesus overhearing the servants, him telling the mourners to leave twice, ordering food for the girl afterwards. These seemingly small, irrelevant details often lend a sense of realism, like genuine memories, rather than a stripped-down legend. Harris suggests authenticity partly because of these details and the lack of the wilder, more fantastical elements you often find in later apocryphal Gospels.
Okay, and Lazarus?
For Lazarus in John 11, Harris points to the wealth of circumstantial details, the specific geography, Bethany near Jerusalem, the personal names, Mary, Martha, Lazarus, the family relationships, and again, the story is brief and simple. Lazarus doesn't give a report from the afterlife. People don't ask him loads of questions about it. It lacks the embellishments you might expect in pure fiction.
What about other nature miracles, like changing water or wine?
Stephen Davis argues for that one, partly based on embarrassment. Why would the early church invent a story about Jesus basically enabling a big party, providing tons of wine? It feeds right into the criticism that he was a glutton and drunkard.
It seems counterproductive for them to make that up.
Exactly. Davis also notes Jesus's somewhat harsh initial response to his mother and the fact that Jesus himself is quite unobtrusive in the story. Again, subtle details that don't fit an obvious agenda for invention.
And the feeding of the 5,000?
Paul Burnett agrees with many scholars that the two versions we have in Mark 6 and John 6 likely come from separate independent traditions, probably based on eyewitness recollections of a very public, memorable event. Multiple accounts again. And
Craig Blomberg brings coherence back in for nature miracles.
Yes. Blomberg argues strongly that the nature miracles cohere perfectly with Jesus' core message about the kingdom of God arriving, often symbolizing its power and abundance, just like his parables did. Based on this coherence and other factors, he concludes the earliest forms of these stories are most probably historical, meaning factual accounts from Jesus' life.
So quite a few scholars are finding these additional historical markers even within the nature miracle accounts.
Definitely. They join folks like Twelftree and Meyer in arguing that there are sufficient signs of historicity to take the nature miracle reports seriously on historical grounds, not just the healings and exorcisms.
Okay, this is building quite a picture. Is there anything else, maybe a broader context, that supports the miracle reports?
Yes. The source points to a sixth factor. The generally increasing view in recent scholarship that the Gospels themselves, while not inerrant historical records in the modern sense, are fundamentally more reliable as historical sources than some earlier critical schools believed.
So a shift in how the Gospels as documents are viewed.
Exactly. While there are still plenty of debates and criticisms, questions about eyewitnesses, potential bias, etc., especially concerning miracles, there's been a noticeable trend, a large increase in recent publications, arguing for a greater degree of historical reliability in the Gospels overall.
What kind of arguments support that?
Several things. One is genre. Most critical scholars now see the Gospels as a form of ancient biography, or bios. Ancient biography aimed to convey historical information, even if its standards were different from ours. So they have a historical framework.
Okay, genre. What else?
A lot of new work has been done on eyewitness testimony, how memory worked in oral cultures, the possibility of notes being taken, the role of key figures like Peter or James in preserving traditions.
So maybe closer to the events than previously thought.
That's the argument some scholars are making forcefully, like Richard Bauckham. Also, the consensus about those early independent sources behind the Gospels, Mark, Q, M, L, etc., pushes the traditions back very early.
And external evidence.
Ancient non-Christian sources, while limited, do corroborate some background details about Jesus and the early church found in the Gospels, lending credibility to the general historical setting they depict.
but there's still disagreements among scholars on this.
Oh, absolutely. It's not a monolithic view, but the overall trend in much recent scholarship has been towards seeing more historical value in the Gospels, particularly in certain sections or traditions identified as early or well attested.
And how does this connect back to the miracles specifically?
The idea is that if the Gospels are seen as generally more reliable historical documents, incorporating early and independent traditions, then the miracle accounts found within them gain credibility too, especially when those specific accounts also show strong internal marks of historicity, like the ones we've been discussing.
So it's a convergence again. The specific evidence for a miracle story is bolstered by the growing confidence in the sources containing that story.
Exactly. As Meyer, Twelftree, Crossan, and others show, these different lines of evidence, multiple sources, enemy attestation, embarrassing details, coherence, textual oddities, and the general reliability of the source documents often overlap and reinforce each other for specific miracle accounts.
And that's what leads someone like Borg, despite his skepticism about miracles in general, to say the healings and exorcisms are virtually indisputable on historical grounds.
Precisely. The cumulative weight of the evidence coming from different angles becomes very difficult for a historian committed to following the data to dismiss.
And this doesn't necessarily depend on proving the authors were eyewitnesses.
Not entirely, no. While some argue for eyewitness authorship or direct reliance, the argument here works even if the authors were careful compilers of earlier reliable traditions stemming from eyewitnesses or other credible observers present in the pre-gospel and gospel material.
Like Ehrman's point about the early creeds.
Exactly. Ehrman, despite his skepticism elsewhere, acknowledges those core creeds in Paul, like 1 Corinthians 15, probably go back to Jerusalem within a couple of years of the crucifixion, originating with apostles like Peter and James. He asks, can we get any closer to an eyewitness report than this? He sees it as a rock-solid start. The sermon summaries in Acts also point to very early tradition attesting the mighty deeds.
So it's a multi-layered argument for reliability.
Yes. It's not just one thing. It's the combination of factors that provides a well-grounded, multifaceted report, as the source puts it, supporting the historicity of Jesus's miracles and exorcisms.
Okay. Is there anything else connecting to the miracles?
The source briefly mentions a seventh point, more of a logical connection, perhaps. It's about the resurrection.
When does the resurrection fit in?
The idea is simple. If you accept the historical evidence for Jesus's resurrection, which is its own huge topic, of course, than the other, earlier miracles reported in his ministry become less problematic and more likely in that context.
Because the resurrection is the biggest miracle claim of all.
Exactly. Crossan called it the supreme nature miracle. If that central climactic event is deemed historical, it sort of recalibrates the scale of what seems plausible regarding the same figure. It creates a different ethos and understanding for evaluating his earlier reported deeds.
So accepting the resurrection would naturally make one more open to the other miracle claims.
It would certainly cast a different light on them, as the source says. It doesn't automatically prove the others happened, but it makes them fit within a narrative where the ultimate boundary, death itself, was apparently overcome by this individual.
Makes sense. Okay, one last area the source brings up. Something about contemporary claims.
Yes, this is the eighth point, and it's quite provocative. It asks whether modern claims of events similar to gospel phenomena healings, maybe even exorcisms, could be relevant to assessing the historical reports.
How so? Isn't the usual argument the other way around, that because we don't see these things today, that ancient stories must be legends?
That is a very common assumption. Skepticism about ancient miracles is often justified by saying, look, modern science shows these things don't happen, we don't witness them now, so the biblical writers must have been mistaken or exaggerating.
Okay, so what's the counter-argument?
The counter-argument, or perhaps just a counter-question, is, what if such events do occur today, but they're often ignored, dismissed, or not widely reported in circles that would accept them as valid evidence? Could carefully documented contemporary cases actually make us more open to the possibility that similar things happened in antiquity?
So are there such documented cases?
The source points to several areas of research suggesting the answer might be yes. Examples include things like medical healings, seemingly linked to prayer, controlled scientific studies on prayer, and modern accounts of phenomena interpreted as exorcism.
Scientific studies on prayer, like double-blind studies.
Yes. The source mentions at least two major double-blind medical studies. One found statistically significant positive effects on recovery for heart patients who were prayed for compared to those who weren't. And crucially, the patients had no idea they were part of the prayer group.
So it couldn't be just a placebo effect from knowing someone was praying.
That's the argument. The study, published in a peer-reviewed journal, led the chief cardiologist involved to conclude that intercessory prayer to the Judeo-Christian God has a beneficial therapeutic effect. Now, this area is highly debated, and other studies have had mixed results, but it challenges the simple assumption that prayer has no measurable effect.
Okay. What about case studies of healings?
Candy Gunther Brown's book, Testing Prayer, published by Harvard University Press, is cited as a rigorous academic look at contemporary healing claims, asking if they can be documented and measured scientifically.
Published by Harvard Press. That suggests serious academic engagement.
And Craig Keener's massive 2-volume work on miracles compiles hundreds of contemporary accounts from around the world. While many are anecdotal, he presents a significant number that are well attested, involving multiple witnesses, sometimes including medical professionals, and occasionally supported by medical evidence like before and after scans showing inexplicable recoveries.
X-rays and MRIs showing changes.
Yes. Keener argues the best attested cases are exceptionally impressive, especially those with that kind of medical documentation or confirmation from multiple doctors who can't explain the sudden healing of serious conditions. He wrote the book partly hoping this modern data would shed light on the New Testament accounts.
Does he cover exorcism too?
Yes. Keener includes contemporary accounts described as exorcisms. The source also mentions studies cited even by skeptics like Borg, such as psychiatrist M. Scott Peck's documented cases involving medical teams who witnessed phenomena they couldn't explain naturally. Other psychiatrists and scholars have also reported similar unexplained data.
So, the argument is that there's a body of modern data, and some of it seemingly well documented, that looks quite similar to the gospel accounts.
That's the suggestion. And even if you dismiss many of these claims, the source argues a large core could still remain that warrants serious thought. These aren't necessarily proof, but they challenge the premise that these things just don't happen.
And you mentioned divine action patterns.
Yes, many of these contemporary accounts, much like the biblical ones, involve elements like prayer, faith, maybe anointing with oil, often happening in a context explicitly linked to Jesus or God's power. The connection to a spiritual dimension seems inherent in the reports themselves, both ancient and modern.
And this might connect back to Borg being open to things like Lazarus.
Right. The source suggests Borg's openness to contemporary possession cases, like Peck's, and even the possibility of real nature healings might stem partly from the strength of the historical data for the gospel accounts, combined with the existence of contemporary phenomena that seem analogous, making the ancient reports seem less alien or impossible.
So the bottom line here is about evidence versus assumptions.
Exactly. The plea is to let the evidence, ancient historical data, and potentially relevant contemporary data guide conclusions, rather than starting with rigid a priori philosophical assumptions about what is or isn't possible.
Like that Bruce Chilton quote.
Yes, Chilton, from the Jesus Seminar, warned against reducing history to just a priori notions of what is possible, saying demons do not exist or miracles can't happen. Might sound rational, he argued, but it risks simply ignoring or explaining away data that doesn't fit the predetermined mold.
And the fact that many critical scholars have accepted the healings and exorcisms historically.
The source sees that as a positive sign. The prevalence of good data likely pushed them towards that conclusion, suggesting an openness to follow the evidence where it leads, even if it challenges modern sensibilities.
Okay, that's a lot to take in. If we try to synthesize this whole deep dive, what are the main takeaways?
I think there are two main themes emerging from the source material. The first, and most explicit, is about that scholarly consensus.
Right, the surprising agreement.
Yes. The contemporary critical view, even among many skeptics, is that the historical evidence indicates Jesus performed actions understood as healings and exorcisms, events quite similar to what the Gospels report. It's almost completely agreed by specialists that he was known as a miracle worker and exorcist in this historical sense.
Dunn's quote comes to mind again, one of the most widely attested and firmly established historical facts.
Exactly. And told as miracles from the first, or Borg calling it firmly attested and virtually indisputable on historical grounds.
And crucially, this isn't just scholarly opinion floating in the air.
No, that's the key point. It's clearly due to the state of the data. It's firmly established and virtually indisputable because of the strength of the historical attestation we walked through. The multiple independent sources, the enemy confirmation, the specific marks in the stories, the reliability of the Gospels, it's a conclusion driven by the evidence, and that's a huge recognition in scholarship.
And the source argues this might apply to nature miracles too, even if less widely accepted.
Yes, based on the fact that much of the same type of evidence supports them within the same sources, especially if one also considers the resurrection historically plausible.
Okay, that's the first theme.
Yeah.
The evidence-based consensus. What's the second?
The second theme is a bit more implicit in this particular discussion as we focused on historicity, not theology, but it's the presence of those divine action patterns.
The connection to prayer, faith, the kingdom.
Right. While historical method might hesitate to confirm divine action, the descriptions of the events themselves, both in the Gospels and in many contemporary reports, intrinsically involve elements pointing towards a spiritual or divine dimension. The connection to God is often already visible in the events themselves as they are reported.
And the contemporary claims add relevance.
They potentially add relevance and maybe even some evidential weight, suggesting these kinds of phenomena might not be confined to the distant past, challenging the idea that they are inherently impossible or solely legendary.
So, wrapping it all up,
When you consider the cumulative force of all this evidence, the scholarly consensus driven by multiple attestation, enemy confirmation, detailed textual analysis, coherence, unique features, the increasing confidence in the Gospels as sources, the potential relevance of contemporary claims, and the possible link to the resurrection, the source suggests the conclusion that Jesus performed deeds perceived as miraculous follows compellingly from the historical data itself.
it sounds like the historical picture is much more complex and, frankly, more startling than just dismissing the miracle stories as legends.
It certainly seems that way, based on where much critical scholarship has landed. It brings to mind that quote attributed to Stephen Neal. Maybe when you look closely at the evidence, you conclude, no one like Jesus has ever lived, taught, or performed such things before or even since. The deeds seem uniquely intertwined with his unique message and claims.
So the final thought for you, the listener, is this. Given this widespread scholarly consensus, built not on faith but on rigorous historical analysis of ancient data, a consensus acknowledging amazing feats and real healings attributed to Jesus and anchored in the earliest traditions, how does that shape your understanding of the historical Jesus? What does it really mean when critical scholars call this aspect of his life virtually indisputable based on the evidence available? That's something to reflect on after this deep dive.